looking at prayer this morning. And once I get my notes, there are four famous people that offered a kind of a commentary on prayer that aren't even religious people, from Abraham Lincoln to Conrad Hilton, who started the Hilton hotel chain, to the former Nirvana drummer, and so on. And so I'll read those when I get my notes. But my whole point, though, in sharing those is this: humanity longs to pray. There is a direct intersection between humanity and prayer. There's a natural human longing for the divine. We love to do that. In fact, there's a Canadian psychologist who calls prayer the soul's native language. The soul's native language. I love that. And what's interesting, though, is that even people who are far from God, who aren't even religious, they're not Christians at all, they still, when life gets tough, when there's a challenge or a tragedy, more often than not, they turn to prayer. They're drawn to it. Maybe you've heard that well-known saying that there are no atheists in a foxhole. And so this morning, we're going to be looking at Luke chapter 11, verse 1. Luke chapter 11, verse 1. And so if you have a Bible, we'll put it up on the screen for you. But before I get into Luke chapter 11, verse 1, there's a really interesting thing to know about this verse. It's really simple and plain. We're doing the audible, folks, with the laptop. Here we go. Luke chapter 11, verse 1. Now I got my notes. We are set. Thank you, guys. Luke chapter 11, verse 1. Here's what we read. One day when Jesus was praying in a certain place, and when he finished, one of his disciples said to him, "Lord, teach us to pray, just as John taught his disciples." Now remember those four quotes that I told you about? Here's what they are. Abraham Lincoln, he once admitted this: "I've been driven many times upon my knees by the overwhelming conviction that I had nowhere else to go. My own wisdom seemed insufficient for that day." And then Conrad Hilton, the famous Hilton hotel chain, he actually wrote an autobiography, and at the very end of it, he devotes an entire section for prayer. And he said this: "In the circle of successful living, prayer is the hub that holds the wheel together." And then the former Nirvana drummer, and then he went to found the Foo Fighters, David Grohl. He talked about praying desperately when his drummer OD'd and had a coma, and he has this to say about prayer. He says, "I would talk to God out loud as I was walking. I'm not a religious person, but I was out of my mind. I was so frightened and heartbroken and confused." And then lastly, a famous British surgeon, well known throughout the world. He would spend his holidays in the world's most dangerous war zones. And he said this about prayer: "I'm not religious, but every now and again I have to pray, and I do pray to God, and I ask Him to help me because sometimes I'm suffering badly. It's only now and again that I'm able to turn to the right frequency to talk to Him, and there is no doubt in my mind there's a God. I don't need Him every day. I need Him every now and again, but when I do need Him, He is certainly there." Now, with that in mind, that kind of general commentary on prayer, that whether you're religious or not, we all are drawn to prayer. Now we move to Luke chapter 11, verse 1. And this is going to be a verse, you probably heard it when I read it to you, that you're kind of like, what? Why bring this up? This is such a simple, plain verse. Like, what's there to reflect on this? Like, why bring up this verse, Mark? I think there's two things that stick out in this verse to me, and you don't even realize it at first, but that are absolutely fundamental and crucial for us as we begin this series on prayer. Prayer for normal people, might I add. Now, key to this, you got to remember who the disciples are. The disciples, Jesus' followers, they're just normal people like you and I. They're not like influential in their city. There's nothing flashy about them. They're just a bunch of smelly fishermen. I mean, Peter presumably would have probably had some fishy prayers. See what I did there? I mean, some of them were hated tax collectors, scum of the earth. They probably, no doubt, they would have been praying for money. None of us do that today. And then even at least one of them was a political zealot, kind of a nationalist, if you will, where all he cared about was politics. And of course, nobody's passionate about politics in today's world. Nobody thinks God is on their political side. Of course, that is all satire. And then we could even talk about two of the disciples being sons of thunder. Like, what does that even mean? What would their prayer life be like? But here you have these normal, everyday people telling Jesus, teach us to pray. Teach us to pray. See, this is prayer for normal people. Just everyday people, blue-collar workers, if you will, and they're saying, Jesus, teach us to pray. This is prayer for normal people. And so what Jesus does, the verses following this, is he gives them what we have identified and call the Lord's Prayer. And we're going to be going through the Lord's Prayer in this series, breaking it apart, looking at different forms and traditions of prayer. Pete Greig has a book, and I love what he calls it. I love what he calls the Lord's Prayer. We're using this for our sermons. Our life groups are using this for the next 8-9 weeks. And he calls it this. His book's titled, How to Pray, A Simple Guide for Normal People. And so right away this morning, I want to invite you as we begin this series to posture yourself with this desire to ask Jesus, Lord, teach me how to pray. Teach me how to pray. Will you make that your cry at least for these next 2 months? Lord, teach me how to pray. Now, what in the world provokes the disciples to ask Jesus such a simple, plain question? Why did they say, Jesus, teach us to pray? I mean, what's going on here? What's the motivation driving this? This is so key to understand this. What provokes the disciples to ask Jesus to teach them to pray is Jesus' own prayer life. I mean, they are personally observing and witnessing Jesus praying, and they want in on it. See, if you want a vibrant, thriving, adventurous, and I think your prayer life should be adventurous, if you want that, then look no further than the life of Jesus. Observe and emulate him. See, most people throughout history, at least after the time of Jesus, it's not that controversial to say that Jesus was the greatest human ever. And so if you want to look, what does it look like to be human? What does it look like to live a flourishing, vibrant, pulsating human life? Look no further than Jesus of Nazareth, the greatest human to ever live, and you want to know what his daily schedule was like. You don't need to go to like the business self-help section at Barnes & Noble to figure this out. The greatest secret to a thriving human life is one consistent element: prayer. Jesus isn't constantly, doing deals on Wall Street or strategizing, playing Pokemon at the Chino shops. No. He's got one consistent element, and that's prayer. Luke 11:1. One day Jesus was praying in a certain place. One day Jesus was praying in a certain place. Hang on to that phrase, a certain place. If you flip over the book before this, the book of Mark chapter 1, verse 35, we read this, and by the way, there are countless verses that we can see this in, but here is just one example. All of you night owls are going to love this. Very early in the morning, before the Chino heat, before the Chino flies come out, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, he left the house, and he went off to a solitary place where he prayed. See, Jesus has this routine, this rhythm built into his every day of going off to a particular place to pray. And we know that Jesus did this before his ministry, after his ministry, before he chose his disciples, before he died, while he was dying. Jesus was constantly in prayer. And so all of this begs the question, before you can begin to even pray, you got to have a place. See, you can pray anywhere, and you're always going to be in a place. I want to ask you this morning. I actually think it's a really profound question. Where's your place? Where's your chair? Where's that certain place where there are no distractions, where you can be alone and quiet and focused on the God of the universe? See, it's not about the place as much as it's about developing a routine where no distractions are hindering you from basking in the presence of God. Do you have a place? Do you have a time that you can center yourself and talk to and listen to your Father? For me, this is something that I've actually been working on literally just in the last 5 to 6 weeks, and I've developed this place, this chair. We'll put a picture up on your screen. I just have this small little side patio. It's our version of a backyard, if you will, and there's there's kind of this outside patio couch thing, and that's my place. That I sit in there. That's my chair. It's my place. Parker's toys are everywhere, and I just sit there. And I try to do it in the morning before I go to emails and all the things of life, kids, frustrations, right? We get it. I know what you're in. And before that happens, before the kids wake up, I try to just sit there. It's outside. I always have a really warm, fresh cup of coffee. Even if it's hot, I got to have that coffee in the morning. I put my phone down. If the kids are up, my wife Rachel is usually watching them. And so I'm just distraction-free, and I'm just communing with the God of the universe. And I got to tell you, this is something that's hard for me. It's hard for me just to sit and to be still and to stop. But as I do this, I can honestly tell you that my mood, my thoughts, my desires, they change, and stress and anxiety are way less. There's nothing better than it. Nothing like it, enjoying the calming sense of God's presence with me. What's your place? Maybe for you, honestly, it's like the shower. That used to be my place. Maybe it's a bench at a park next to your house. Maybe it's your backyard. I don't know. But what's your place? You need to have one. And I think it's worth mentioning, it's not probably in your car as you're parked on the 91 freeway. It's probably not while you're watching your child at their soccer game or something. Those are great places to pray, and you can do that. But I'm talking about a place that's like alone, quiet, distraction-free. One day, Jesus was praying in a certain place. And when he finished, one of his disciples said to him, "Lord, teach us to pray, just as John taught his disciples." See, once we get to our place of prayer, we can then begin to ask, okay, Jesus, teach us to pray. And it's so interesting. When Jesus' disciples asked him this question, he didn't respond with like this really long, sophisticated, religious, holier than thou prayer. He gives them the Lord's Prayer. And that's exactly what we're going to unpack in the next 2 months as we talk about different kinds and formats of prayer. And so I'm not going to get into it this morning. We'll do that next Sunday. But using Pete Greig and a model in his book, I want us just to look at 3 really simple, basic components of how to pray that we get from Jesus throughout the Gospels. Pete Greig, he has this great framework for prayer. It's catchy. It's this. Here are the 3 ways. Keep it simple, keep it real, and keep it up. Keep it simple, keep it real, and keep it up. First one, keep it simple. Matthew's Gospel. There are 2 places that have the Lord's Prayer for us, Matthew and Luke. If you go to Matthew chapter 6, right before Jesus gives the Lord's Prayer, I want to read for us the scene right before. I'm going to read it first in the Message, and then secondly, in a couple of minutes, I'll read it out of the NIV. But first, in the Message. The world is full of so-called prayer warriors who are prayer ignorant, peddling techniques for getting what you want from God. Don't fall for that nonsense. This is your Father you are dealing with, and He knows better than you what you need. With a God like this loving you, you can pray very simply. And then Jesus goes on to give the Lord's Prayer in Matthew 6. Did you know that the Lord's Prayer in its original language is only 31 words and it actually rhymes? It's actually this really simple, beautiful poem. See, it's simple. It's not complicated. It's not sophisticated. It's not a bunch of holier than thou religious language that just turns into a show-off laundry list. This is a prayer for normal people like you. Archbishop Justin Welby from the UK, he says this about the Lord's Prayer. This is so good. He says it's simple enough to be memorized by small children, and yet profound enough to sustain a whole lifetime of prayer. Friends, brothers and sisters, relax in the simplicity of prayer. See, God already knows what you need. He just wants to hear your voice. He just wants to be with you. Keep it simple. Less is more. Secondly, we keep it simple, and now secondly, we keep it real. Keep your prayer life real. Same passage that I just read from Matthew 6. Let me read it now in the NIV translation, verses 7 through 8. And when you pray, by the way, Jesus is assuming you're praying. Do not keep on babbling like pagans, for they think they'll be heard because of their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask Him. Let me ask you this. Is your prayer life honest? Is your prayer life honest? I love what Pete Greig says. He says, often the church is less honest than the Bible. The Bible is often more honest than the church. I mean, listen to Psalm 55:17. Here's an interesting verse to meditate on. Evening and morning and at noon, so the whole day, I will complain and murmur, and He will hear my voice. Evening and morning and at noon, I will complain and murmur, and He will hear my voice. Are you honest to God in your prayers? Or do you hide from and put aside all the real messy stuff so you come across as holy and religious? Do you kind of only deal with stuff on the surface of your life and bottle up all your emotions? Or do you express your grief, your anger, your sadness to God? Here's an interesting one, I see this a lot. Do you only pray for other people and then ignore your own honest needs? See, you don't need to impress God. He knows all of your junk already. He knows all of your needs. There's nothing to hold back from him. Do you believe that God is big enough, powerful enough, and wise enough to deal with all of your issues? Is your prayer life keeping it real? Thirdly and lastly, here's the toughest one. Keep at it. Do you give up easily in your prayer life? Another way of asking this is, do you only pray when you need help? Do you only pray when you need help? If you were with us 2 weeks ago when I wrapped up the letter to the Ephesians, I mentioned this parable, this story that Jesus tells in Luke chapter 18. It's called the parable of the persistent widow. And Jesus, he tells this story to make the point of don't give up in your prayer life. And so he talks about this lady who just consistently, faithfully and obnoxiously just continues to go to this judge and just annoys him, bugs him, and keeps on asking him to see her case. And finally, she annoys him so much that he says, fine, I'll give you what you want. I'll settle your case for you because I don't want to see you come back to me. Jesus' point in saying his prayers keep at it in the sense of be persistent. Keep on praying to him. Don't give up. Be intentional. See, beautiful, worthwhile relationships take time and investment to build in. You got to keep at it. Right? And so you develop, hopefully, routines and rhythms in your life, not just to survive, but to thrive. If you are in an intimate relationship, once you get engaged or get married, hopefully you don't stop dating each other. Right? But you build in a rhythm, maybe a date night every Friday night, every Saturday night to deepen your marriage. You keep at it. You celebrate anniversaries. You keep at it. And it's not just in marriage or in friendships that we see this, but if you're trying to get physically fit, if you're trying to get healthy, you don't just eat a clean diet for one day or even 1 week. You keep at it weeks, months, years. It takes intentionality. I could give countless other examples, but the point is your prayer life with God is no different. You got to keep at it. Not out of obligation, not out of rule following, not out of rigidity, because you just really want to be with the one who knows you and loves you more than anyone else. Let me end with this. I think prayer is like learning a new language. It's like learning a new language. I remember when I was in seminary, which is grad school for pastors, one of the things you have to do usually is learn Greek and Hebrew. You got to learn 2 new languages. And of course, nobody's familiar with these. We don't speak these languages. They're actually considered what's called dead languages. Even a modern day Hebrew and Greek is kind of a different version of ancient Hebrew and Greek. And so it is quite a battle to learn these new languages. And Hebrew is nothing like English grammar. It's literally like the opposite. It reads backwards. There are no vowels. You just look at Hebrew, and at least for me, it kind of just looks like a bunch of artistic renderings. And so the way you learn Greek and Hebrew, at least for me, was I kind of just got to put all myself in. I got to immerse myself in the language every single day throughout the day. It's interesting, if you go to a seminary or if you're at a Starbucks or something, you can kind of usually tell if there's someone in seminary trying to learn Greek or Hebrew, because I can almost guarantee you they'll have these flashcards and they keep them in their pocket or their backpack. And whenever they can, whenever they get a break, lunch, dinner, or whatever it is, they'll bring out the flashcards and they'll flip through them so that they can learn their vocabulary. See, learning a language is not easy. Why? Because it's you have to learn a completely new way to communicate your thoughts and your feelings and your ideas. I just read this a couple days ago. Research shows that if you spent 10 hours a day immersing yourself in a new language, and by the way, who has 10 hours a day? But if you spent 10 hours a day, you could become fluent in that language 48 days later, and that's if it's an easy language to learn. But you can guess, just from life experience, or maybe if you've kind of gone through the whole Rosetta Stone thing and you've given up, most people give up before they become fluent in another language. And the same thing is true of prayer. See, prayer, it's a language of its own. It's a language that God has designed for us to communicate to Him. And so we have our own special, unique language with God. But the good thing is this: it's actually not foreign to you. You are actually intrinsically wired to communicate with God. But here's the deal: it takes time, it takes practice, it takes immersion. To become fluent in prayer is to have your life forever changed and opened up to God's divine culture. And so just as flashcards were a really practical tool for me, I just want to share 3 simple, basic things that anybody can do so that you can deepen your prayer life, that you can learn God's language for you. Here they are, really simple. Think morning, afternoon, evening. First thing, when you wake up in the morning, what if you spent the first 15 minutes praying? Find your chair, find your place for just 15 minutes. I'm not saying an hour, I'm not saying 45 minutes, although if you want to do that, great. But just 15 minutes, can you practice listening to God, talking to Him? Secondly, for your lunch break, if you don't take one, take one. For just 5 minutes, I'm just talking 5 minutes, people, read the Lord's Prayer. Just read the Lord's Prayer either out loud or in your mind. Just read the prayer that God gave us. Matthew 6, Luke 11. And then thirdly, there's an ancient practice called praying the prayer of examen. Don't worry about the name. All it means is at the end of your day before you go to bed, 5-10 minutes, it encourages you to reflect on your day. So 3 R's. Reflect on your day, and do that by this: rejoicing in what has gone well. How can you rejoice God? How can you praise God for the good things that have happened? Reflect, rejoice. Thirdly, repent. What do you need to repent from in your day that you did? Where have you messed up? Where do you need to make that U-turn? Reflect on your day by rejoicing and repenting. And so I just want to leave you with those 3 simple things as we begin this 2-month journey into prayer, looking especially at the Lord's Prayer and the different elements of it.